thank you all very, very much for being here. It's a great honor to be here. I chose this title, Realms of Gold, in an allusion to the Keats sonnet about reading Chapman's translations of Homer, not realizing that, of course, it's the colors of University of Iowa, so that's why I chose it. I don't know, I should have understood that. So I'm going to talk a little bit in general about translation and why it's so difficult. Then I'm going to talk about my approach to translating the Odyssey, and I'll talk a little bit about the reception of my translation and how I felt like the reception of the translation didn't entirely match what I actually was trying to do with that translation. Then I'll talk more briefly about the Iliad. I'll read a couple of passages from both translations, and then I'll talk a tiny bit about, there was an extra re in the re translation, so I'm going to talk a tiny bit about that at the end. I would love to have questions at the end, so please do ask a question if you have a question. So in general, translation is not an easy thing to do, and it's hard to think about, hard to talk about, as well as hard to do. You probably all know the famous story of the ship of Theseus, the mythical Athenian king who sailed to Crete in this famous ship, and then by the time after all his travels he got back home, the ship had none of the same components that it had had when he set out, right? It was a completely different ship, and yet it was still the ship of Theseus, and it had continuity with the ship he'd set out in. Can it still be the same ship if it has none of the same elements? My translations of Homer have the word Homer on the cover. They also have the word Emily Wilson. None of the words are actually the same as in the original Greek poems, and yet they're marketed as the Homeric poems. Is that just a cheat? How can that possibly be the case? One thing I love about the ship of Theseus is that the Wikipedia page about the ship of Theseus has none of the same words that the original Wikipedia page had. So how can it be the same Wikipedia page? That kind of challenge always arises in the case of translation. I think people sometimes think translation is difficult only if it's some big fancy thing, only if it's an epic poem, only if it's ancient, and ancient languages are supposed to be harder than modern languages. They aren't necessarily. I think all languages are quite difficult to be fully immersed in. Translation is not difficult just if it's poetry. Even non-literary translation is very difficult and often a very thankless task. People labor away being paid by the word on business translation, legal translation, medical translation. All of those things are really important. These are less important kinds of translation, but they're also easy to get wrong if you're not fully immersed in the idioms of both languages. And that's the case because, as Professor Rose already hinted, translation is the most intense kind of writing as well as the most intense kind of reading. It's not just that in order to translate well, you need to be fully, very, very deeply immersed in the whole world and every word, every sound, every syllable, every note, every mood, every pace, everything about the original, but you also then need to do the whole other, I think actually more difficult task of figuring out how do I then rewrite this thing so that it won't feel like a fraud that the name of the original is on the cover and yet use none of the same words. If you don't think about how difficult it is as a writing task and you only think about it or primarily think about it as a reading task, I think you're not going to understand half the task, or maybe more than half of the task. I would also argue that translation discourse is difficult and problematic, especially in the hegemonic Anglophone world in general, because many people don't think very much about translation. But I would say that translation is even more conceptualized in limiting ways within the world of classics because of the pedagogy of ancient languages. In beginning classes in Latin and ancient Greek, students are very often taught to quote-unquote translate as if they're solving a crossword puzzle. And what they're doing is look up the words in the dictionary, figure out the syntax, solve the crossword puzzle, hand in to your teacher this hideous thing that has no relationship to the style of the original, but demonstrates to your teacher that you've done your homework. That's translation. Whereas in a class on a language that's still spoken, students understand that the goal of learning Mandarin or learning Spanish is to be able to communicate and read and have all these skills in the language, as opposed to translate. a student in introductory Spanish class doesn't think, I'm going to translate Don Quixote today, because you've actually only been reading the language for 2 weeks. You're probably not going to produce a retranslation of Don Quixote that's going to be interesting to somebody who's read the original or read other translations, but you might be aspiring to do that after several more years of doing the language. And so the translation means something different within the world of introductory Latin class from what it might mean in the case of a published literary translation. In the case of if you're grading a bunch of language exams, you understand that what I'm doing is I'm looking out to see who understood the syntax and who didn't. In the case of looking at multiple different translations or retranslations of the same original by reasonably competent professionals, I'm not looking to see who misunderstood the syntax. I'm looking primarily to see what kind of interpretation of the whole world and vibe and feel of the original is created by this translation as opposed to that translation, with the understanding that what is this text like? What matters about it? How does it feel to read it in the original? Isn't a question where there's a single answer to what is that like even in a single language, let alone how many translations of Homer are there into other languages. These are all self-portraits of Picasso by Picasso, and I think that other interpretative modes like portrait painting or representational art or directing or performing a score, all of these interpretative modes don't just have one way you can do it. There are multiple ways you can do it, and Picasso wasn't lying in his blue period and then telling the truth in the Cubist period. All of these are different kinds of truths. So as well as thinking hard about writing and aspiring to be as good at writing as she or he can be, a translator also ideally needs to think through what kind of portrait am I making of the original? If I haven't thought about that question, maybe my portrait will be incoherent, because I won't be able to do all different possible portraits in the same time, in the same text. Within the world of translation studies, one of the big elements of the discourse, primarily spearheaded by Larry Venuti, but picking up on earlier writers about translation, Schleiermacher and Berman, has been a call to foreignize wherever possible, to make the art of translation itself more visible, and to make the Anglophone, presumably imagined to be narrow-mindedly, provincially Anglophone reader, understand, oh, I'm reading a translated text. This is reminding me of that because the sentence structure feels weird. There are elements that feel weird. I think there were things to be said about that, said in favor of that intervention in the case of translations of contemporary fiction, where the reader of The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo may not really understand unless they're reminded, actually you read a translation of that book, you didn't read that book in the original. In the case of pre-modern texts, I think the horizon of expectations is so different that we actually need to rethink what does it mean to make translation visible, and that foreignizing actually doesn't make translation visible in the case of translation of canonical ancient texts, because it's predictable. And if you pick up a translation of an ancient classic, your expectation is very likely going to be, this will be more or less unreadable and super boring, but I have to read it because my teacher said so and it's canonical. And so if you then read a translation which confirms all your prejudices, you haven't actually had an encounter with the strangeness and as well as the aliveness of the ancient text. So I think that there has to be a pushing back against the idea that we must just foreignize in totally predictable ways. There may be other ways to make the ancient strange, or to make the foreign strange, that aren't the same as, let's just echo the weird word order. Because the weird word order is usually the least interesting thing about a text in a different language. The reception of my work had two main headlines. Right, and I don't feel like I need to talk about the woman one, because everyone knows about that. And obviously, the woman one is clearly related to the discourse about how I've destroyed the Western canon and Western civilization, which actually is much harder to destroy than you might think if you read those guys on Twitter. So I'm not going to spend too long on that. The one that I wanted to pause for a second about is the modern discourse. In the case of my translation of the Iliad, the headline writers couldn't use the woman headline because Carol Alexander, kudos to her, had already published a translation of the Iliad. So that headline was unavailable, and headline writers are not very accustomed to writing headlines about translations. So I understand that it was a problem. But to me, that both of these headlines are very debatable and problematic in the assumptions that they make. In the case of the modern one, I worry that modern is being used to mean surprisingly interesting, as if one might think everything ancient was completely boring and nobody in antiquity ever created any interesting artifacts or interesting literature or had any real feelings. It seems to me that those things aren't actually true, and that modern shouldn't be a synonym for interesting, and that's actually a problem in itself. So in terms of my priorities, and none of these are any good as headlines, so I understand why none of them were mentioned by the headline writers. But in general, even beyond the translations of Homer, I want to constantly remind myself that the semantic meaning is obviously the minimum, but it's never enough. I need also to be constantly thinking about how does it sound? How does it feel? How does this character talk differently from that character? All the translations I've published have been of performance texts which have multiple different voices. I think it actually matters for my translations of Homer that I had published translations of drama beforehand, and that a lot of my work had been about tragedy as well as epic. And so I was approaching the task of translating the Homeric poems from the perspective of trying to lean into the ways that these poems are performance texts with multiple different voices and different emotional effects. I also think one of the big interesting things in Homeric scholarship over the last couple of decades has been an increased awareness of just how multiple the narrative perspectives in the Homeric poems are. And then just, I guess, in terms of my background, I'd published various books and studies of reception of classical literature before coming to be a translator. So I was interested in the history of translation before I was a practicing translator. And I was also interested in especially early modern Anglophone English literature as well as ancient literature. And I think my training in Shakespeare, Milton, all of those people actually had a huge impact in what I wanted to do with Homer. I wanted to create translations of the Homeric poems that would feel like English epics in some way or other. So I've published translations of lots of different ancient texts. The Iliad and the Odyssey are obviously the ones I'm going to focus on, but I also wanted to emphasize with the little picture of the chameleon that I hope that not all my translations sound exactly the same. I hope that there are ways that the denseness and riddlingness of Sophocles' poetics sounds very different from the fluency and clarity of Homeric poetics. Homer should feel more aerated and less dense. Seneca's elusiveness, I felt I could do quotations from earlier English literature if I'm translating Seneca, because Seneca's always alluding to Ovid or Virgil. I shouldn't do that kind of show-off bombast if I'm doing Homer, even though I love it, because that's not what Homer sounds like. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about my translation of the Odyssey, which came out in 2017. And I'll just start by just doing the beginning, the proem, and I guess I'll predictably talk about the famous word in that. But you can ask me about other words too if you want, because there are actually more words than that. Andra moi ennepe musa polutropon hos mala polla plankthe pe troias hieron toliethron persen polon danthro poni dynastia kai no negno polodogen ponto pathanalgea hon katathumon auronomenos hen tepsuken kai noston hetairon alud hos heterusa rusato hiemenos per auton gas veteres in atastalios in elonto nepioi hoi katabus hyperion os helioio estion autar hotoisin aphelato nostimon emar ton hemothenge thea thugate dios epe kai hemin. Okay, now I'm going to do my 2017 translation of that. Tell me about a complicated man. Muse, tell me how he wandered and was lost when he had wrecked the holy town of Troy, and where he went, and who he met, the pain he suffered on the sea, and how he worked to save his life and bring his men back home. He failed, and for their own mistakes they died. They ate the sun god's cattle, and the god kept them from home. Now, goddess, child of Zeus, tell the old story for our modern times. Find the beginning. So everyone always talks about complicated. It seems to me that I'm not trying, ideally, primarily, to be quote-unquote modern in using that word. I've reconsidered it many, many times and wondered and wondered and wondered, can I improve on that line, on any of the lines? I think I can improve on almost all of the lines. I don't think I can improve on that line. The reason is that I'm using iambic pentameter. It's a regular traditional meter to echo the regular traditional dactylic hexameter of the original. I also, in the 2017 translation of the Odyssey, confined myself to the exact same number of lines as the original, because one of the things I'd constantly felt in using a bunch of different translations in my teaching with undergraduates was that students would often get bogged down and think, Homer's kind of slow and a bit boring. And I would think, how can you think that? That's not true. And then I would realize the translation is kind of slow and a bit boring because it's not paying attention to pacing. So ideally, I don't want to do what many translators have done when faced with a great multivalent word like polutropos and use a whole relative clause, use a whole phrase, use a man who, blah, 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 and then you've used 10 different words instead of one word. Ideally, it's great if you can use the same number of syllables. At least I felt it was great if I could. I also knew that in terms of what we know about the connotations of that word in later Greek texts, that it definitely doesn't mean the same as the more common epithets of Odysseus, like polymerkenos or polymertis, which refer to his resourcefulness, his problem-solving ability, his cunning, or polyklas, referring to his ability to endure and stick it out and have the most that he can hold his tongue and he can be patient for 20 years and eventually attain his goals. But that's not what we're told about him in the first line. What we're told in the first line is this very unusual epithet, which only occurs twice in the Homeric poems, which arguably, I'm not the only person to argue this, is chosen programmatically to refer not just to the protagonist with his many turns and his many disguises, but also to the journey and the poem that we're about to read. So if the word I choose is just you expect Odysseus to be like this, and it can't refer to the journey or the poem as well, it's not a great translation choice, in my opinion. I think it needs to be surprising, but I also think it needs to convey some meaning, which polutropos definitely does. Anyway, there are other things one can say about that, as about every other translation choice in the universe. So in general, just as I was picking up on what I said before about how I think a translator has ideally to make some choices about what really matters about the original text and understand that I may not be able to convey all of these things all the time to the same degree, but I need to think through what are the priorities in terms of what does this original text feel like. As I already referred to, the fact that the original is a poem in a traditional meter designed for performance out loud. It has both regular meter and a lot of other sonic patternings, a lot of assonance, some alliteration, this perform out loud ability. We know that rhapsodes, at least later in antiquity, could become celebrities performing Homer. It was entertainment as well as performed at festivals. So there needs to be an element of perform out loud ability, rhythmicality, musicality. There needs to be something or other that makes you feel, I need to hear more of this, which I certainly feel about the original. And I still feel, after however many decades of reading Homer, I still feel like I could listen to this all day long. It's great. And then there should also, I think ideally, and I try to do this in various degrees in my translations, be elements of both huge emotional impact and psychological subtlety and depth, especially when people are talking to each other and you can understand how both the characters feel and they feel different ways. Homer is amazing at doing that, and not all translations convey those qualities, in my opinion. And then also that there are things about the Homeric world that are really weird and strange, which includes things like the metaphors for how do the Homeric poems think about the body, such as the way that the body is a cluster of knots which unravel when you die. That's not usually how we think about our bodies. And yet I think it's something which can be conveyed in a translation. It seems to me that if I have to make a choice between different kinds of strange, if I have to choose, am I going to use kind of weird, unorthodox word order? I could do that, and I will convey to the reader or the listener, this is a translation from ancient Greek. Or I can use less weird word order, but focus on other kinds of weirdness, like let the limbs unravel if they're going to unravel. Then you can be taken to a, I think, more provocative and potentially more enlightening way that we can think about the world differently through thinking about and inhabiting a new set of metaphors. So when I was first asked to consider doing this Odyssey translation, very long time ago now, it sort of feels like ancient history, I wasn't sure whether to do it, and then I thought, meditating on my own experience in the classroom with multiple different translations and then looking at what was out there, that there were ways that the existing translations, there were a lot of them that were very, very similar to each other. At least I thought, and I still think this. Many of them, in fact, the majority of the modern translations don't use meter, as if meter couldn't be a thing that one could use in the 20th or 21st century. Many of them use unidiomatic English, and then, so that's one category, the sort of Lattimore category. There's Lattimore, and there are many imitators of Lattimore. And then there were also the much more colloquial or cliche-rich ones, like the Fagles translations or the Lombardo translations, which are much chattier. Both categories use free verse, but in different ways of using the English language. I also felt that many of the translations that I'd used flatten out the point of view and multiplicity of voices in the original. So this is why I used the Realms of Gold line. This famous sonnet by Keats, which I'm sure probably everyone in this room more or less knows this sonnet by heart, so maybe it's kind of insulting to talk about it, but I think it's still a great poem. So this is a poem dashed off by Keats. There aren't that many sonnets about translation. Dashed off by Keats after having spent a great night staying up super late with a friend reading bits of Chapman's Homer out loud together, and Keats sort of realized, wow, I could actually use some phrases from this. They actually sound Keatsian, and he could use that for his own poetic creativity. This is part of that sonnet. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told that deep-browed Homer ruled as his demesne. Yet never did I breathe its pure serene, till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken. And then the Realms of Gold bit is actually a little bit later. But the point I want to make about this sonnet and its imagery is that Keats focuses on an idea of newness, but he does it in a context where he'd presumably already dipped into the Pope translations, which were much more recent from his historical perspective, and maybe also the Cooper translations. Chapman was the earliest translation. It was not new, and yet it also was new to Keats, and it could open up a new world for him. That's also why it seems to me that it matters that he uses this metaphor of the new planet and the new world. So he imagines the colonizing explorer standing upon a peak in Darien, seeing the quote-unquote new world. New world was not new. New world was already here and actually lived in by many people. The new planet was not new. It had been out there in the cosmos before it was seen by human telescopes. And Chapman is the same way. It had been out there, Homer had been out there, but not seen in the same way until the right translation met the right reader. And so part of what I want to take away from looking back to Keats, looking back to Chapman, is that it isn't actually about being as modern as possible. If you want to try to enable the experience of whoever the 21st century Keatses are out there, which ideally I would like the Keatses of this world to be reading Homer and be excited about it, whether or not they get to learn Greek. Keats famously longed to have more access to ancient Greek than he ever got. So newness doesn't have to mean being chatty. It doesn't have to mean using slang. It can actually mean doing something extremely old-fashioned, which is what I do. So I think the modern headline is wrong, and that the New York Times review of my Odyssey translation mention the fact that this reviewer thought that it was in some ways like a Matthew Arnold translation, which I think is the right framing. Matthew Arnold was a terrible, snobby Victorian gentleman whose politics I do not endorse. But I also think he was actually a pretty good poet, and his famous account of the four qualities of a Homer translation, rapid, plain and direct, in both syntax and thought, and noble, whatever that may mean, I actually think those are good things that I have found useful in bear in mind when thinking through what are my touchstone primary qualities that I want to convey to whoever the 21st century Keatses might be who might be reading this. Arnold never did a translation of the Homeric poems, but his little samples of how one might do this and how you could do it better than his the guy he's so mean to, poor Francis Newman, who wrote an unreadable translation which sunk without trace beyond the fact that it was dissed by Arnold. I think in some ways I'm trying to fulfill some version of what Arnold said one should do in 1861. So it seems to me quite funny that people think, oh wow, this is so modern. I think it's actually very Victorian in a lot of ways. In general, so what does nobility mean? It doesn't have to mean being snobby, but I think it does have to mean something about traditionalness, performability out loud. I try to make sure that my English has an element of elevation, for instance, by the trick of not using contractions. I don't have doesn't, and I don't have, all that kind of thing. I try to minimize cliches. I try not to do fancy allusions. I try to think about how can I be grand without being grandiose. If I'm translating Seneca, I think grandiose is great. It works fine. If I'm translating Homer, there should be a different kind of grandeur. There should be a simple, direct, plain kind of grandeur in many cases. So I'm just going to read another passage from the Odyssey. I'm going to talk about the Iliad much shorter. The one thing I want to say before I get to this is just that this is a wonderful passage, and I think it illustrates what I was saying a minute ago about the fact that the Homeric poems are great at conveying multiple points of view. This is the scene in which Penelope tests Odysseus by pretending that she can pull out the bed, which famously can't be moved because it's been made out of a tree that's growing all through the house, and one of its the trunk of the tree is one of the posts of the bed, so nobody could possibly move it. So it's an image of the immobility and stability of Odysseus's heteronormative marriage, such that even though he's been absent from the marital bed for 20 years, it still couldn't possibly be moved. And one thing that I think is really important about this passage is that the bed, this piece of furniture, obviously is a symbolic piece of furniture, but also really clearly in the language of the Greek, conveys very different things, means very different things to the two characters. And just one detail so you can listen out for it. In the Greek, Odysseus repeatedly uses the first person singular. I made this, my bed, that's me, I did this, and I did this, and I did this, it's my bed. Whereas she uses, in Greek, there is both a singular and a plural and a dual. So if you want to emphasize, it's not lots of people, it's not just me, it's two of us, which is used, for instance, by Diomedes and Sthenelus in the Iliad. It's used of Achilles and Patroclus. It's used of Penelope, of what could have been in this marriage. It could have been a duel, but that's not how he sees the bed. And I'm not saying that to diss Odysseus, love Odysseus, but I think it's really important that the translation should not lean into the sort of sentimentalizing move that I see both in some accounts of this scene of the Odyssey marriage in general in criticism, but also I see signs of that in some translations where it seems to be focalized through Odysseus' perspective. What's great is he's got his wife back, as opposed to we're seeing two sides to this marriage. We're seeing her side as well as his side. So it's not about homophrosyne, which is used only once in the Odyssey when Odysseus is chatting up Nausicaa, not what's represented by this marriage. She spoke to test him. And Odysseus was furious and told his loyal wife, "Woman, your words have cut my heart. Who moved my bed? It would be difficult, for even a master craftsman, though a god could do it with ease. No man, however young and strong, could pry it out. There is a trick to how this bed was made. I made it, no one else.
Inside the court there grew an olive tree with delicate long leaves, full grown and green, as sturdy as a pillar, and I built the room around it. And then he explains how he built it. Now I have told the secret trick, the token, but woman, wife, I do not know if someone, a man, has cut the olive trunk and moved my bed, or if it is still safe. At that, her heart and body suddenly relaxed. She recognized the tokens he had shown her. She burst out crying and ran straight towards him and threw her arms around him, kissed his face and said, "Do not be angry at me now, Odysseus. In every other way, you are a very understanding man. The gods have made us suffer. They refused to let us stay together and enjoy our youth until we reach the edge of age together. Please forgive me. Do not keep bearing a grudge, because when I first saw you, I would not welcome you immediately. I felt a constant dread that some bad man would fool me with his lies. There are so many dishonest, clever men. That foreigner would never have got Helen into bed if she had known the Greeks would march to war and bring her home. It was a goddess who made her do it, putting in her heart the passion that first caused my grief as well. Now you have told the story of our bed, the secret that no other mortal knows, except yourself and me and just one slave, actress, whom my father gave to me when I came here, who used to guard our room. You made my stubborn heart believe in you." This made him want to cry. He held his love, his faithful wife, and wept. As welcome as the land to swimmers, when Poseidon wrecks their ship at sea and breaks it with great waves and driving winds, a few escape the sea and reach the shore, their skin all caked with brine. Grateful to be alive, they crawl to land. So glad she was to see her own dear husband, and her white arms would not let go his neck. You don't have... Okay, I'm going to do like really short talk, because I've already talked mostly already about my approach to translating Homer, so I'm not going to pause too much on how my translation of the Iliad was different, but I want to just emphasize that in the course of doing this, I did change my mind about some things, and that included the realization, which I actually had halfway through the Odyssey, but it was too late by then, that it might be good not to confine myself quite so rigidly to the line-for-line thing, which I think was useful in terms of its forcing me to be decisive and really figure out what's the heart of the scene, this line, what really matters here. But I also constantly found myself kicking up against, if I just had one more syllable to play with, I could do more with that. So with the Iliad, I let myself have more lines than the original, which I ended up liking a lot more. I gave up on the line-for-line thing after trying to do the catalogue of ships and realizing it was impossible because those names actually have as many syllables as they're going to have. I can't abbreviate the names. Names really matter in this poem, which is all about dying for a name and being connected to others through names. Kleos matters. It's all about naming. So I needed to have more lines. And then once I had more lines, there were other things I could do. I could be more rigid about the repetition of epithets. With the Odyssey translation, I thought the literate reader is going to get the sense of this is very repetitive after fewer instances of repetition than the imagined ancient reader would feel about the Homeric poems. With the Iliad translation, I thought, actually, maybe they can tolerate more repetition than I thought, and I can just hurl a lot of repetition. And actually, I ended up thinking, maybe that's okay. And I also knew that just in terms of the differences between the poems, the Iliad needs to feel extremely intense, that there are ways the Odyssey is spreads out all across the fake mythical Mediterranean world, and also is diffuse in the ways that it's about these complicated and difficult and deferred kinds of realizations and recognitions and relationships. Whereas the Iliad is always about these very, very fast and intense feelings and death, 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 noise, 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 ratcheted up to 11 all the time. So that was a different kind of writing problem. I'm going to do the proem of the Iliad, and I will talk about one detail from that. Menin aida thea, Pelea do Achilleos, Ulamanen, Hermuria Kaio Salgea Theca, Polas difthimus psukas aidi proiapsin, heroum, autuste heloria tuke kunesin, oio noisite daita, dios de teleto bule, exudeta prota, diaste tener santa, atredes ten Alexandron, kai dios Achilles. So I'll do my translation of that, which is, Goddess, sing of the cataclysmic wrath of great Achilles, son of Peleus, that caused the Greeks immeasurable pain and sent so many noble souls of heroes to Hades and made men the spoils of dogs, a banquet for the birds. And so the plan of Zeus unfolded, starting with the conflict between great Agamemnon, lord of men, and glorious Achilles. So the one translation choice that, again, one could talk about a million translation choices even with a 7-line passage, but the one translation choice that I want to emphasize, and I'm not giving you lots of examples of what other translators have done, except for this one. In the original, it's really clear that what the stakes of the poem are in terms of what will the costs be of Achilles' superhuman wrath. Lots of people on his own side will die, and they will not just die, but have the most humiliating possible lack of chaos afterwards, in that they will be not just regular dog food, regular bird food, but a banquet and booty for the dogs and birds. The dogs and birds get to have this honorific position that the warriors themselves want. And what's being eaten, devoured honorifically by the dogs and the birds of prey is not the corpses, the bodies of the men, but the men themselves, autus. And what goes to Hades is the psyche, the fluttery, bat-like spirit, which is not the same as the self. The primary self is lying there on the battlefield, getting dishonored and eaten up by dogs. That's not good. So if you don't understand that in the first lines, you may not, but it should be, I think, present in the translation for you to get if you pay attention closely to what's being said, such that you understand the stakes of who lays claim to the dead Patroclus or then the dead Hector. It's not that Hector, in coming back to Troy after his death, that's not the corpse of Hector. That's Hector, whom his father has gone to bring home so that he can have, at last, a homecoming after leaving home for most of the poem. So I really wanted not to do what many, many translations that I've looked at do, which is make this contrast between the souls of heroes and the bodies, or the fighters' souls and the bodies, which implies this post-Platonic or maybe Cartesian model of there's a soul, the body, the main bit of it is probably the soul. It seems to me that the soul is what goes to Hades, but then it's the men that are the spoils of dogs. And the men are what we really care about, rather than the souls, which are kind of an afterthought. And so I'm going to read just one more very short passage from the Iliad, and then I will do one tiny, very short passage from the Odyssey, and then I'd love to have questions from you in a couple of minutes. One thing I want to say about this passage from the Iliad, which is Achilles responding with devastation, as you can see in burrito guise, to the death of Patroclus. He's talking to his sea goddess mother Thetis, who has done absolutely everything he asked for, but kids are never grateful. She's ensured that that many of the Greeks on his side will be massacred while he's sitting out of the battle. In making this monkey's paw wish, Achilles hasn't thought through that there's one Greek he really cares about, which is Patroclus. So when Thetis says that she's done all this and Zeus has made it all come true, he responds with this devastated and furious account of how his wrath against Agamemnon has now transformed into something else, and transformed into the desire not just to kill Hector, but to massacre everyone on the Trojan side forever, and to himself die as soon as possible after he does that. So it seems to me that one of the big challenges of translating this passage is just to make sure the emotional impact is there, to make sure that the reader fully understands how devastating and how broken Achilles is, but also I'll just talk about two other challenges. One is that the Greek verb apolesa, apolumi, it means both I destroyed and I lost. So he says ton apolesa, that it seems to me that it matters that it might be both, right? It's not just that he's lost his dearest person, it's also that it's kind of his own stupid fault. So that element of being angry at himself as well as at Hector and the Trojans and the whole world seems to me that ideally should be audible in this translation. And then another sort of classic translation dilemma is what to do with idioms and metaphors that are a normal thing in the original, but then the metaphor might not be totally dead. So he says, Patroklos ton ego peripanton tion hetairon, ison eme kephaler, equal to my head, which clearly means I loved him like a second self, but it also, to me, seems important that it's I would argue, not a dead metaphor, because we've had a lot of decapitation in this poem. Agamemnon, in particular, loves cutting people's heads off. And so the fact that Achilles is returning to battle as if he's decapitated seems to me important and something that ideally the translation should convey. I said before about how my priorities include both pacing and a whole bunch of other things. In the case of this passage, I felt that I couldn't do what I talked about in the case of Complicated, of try not to be too long-winded, try not to make it far longer than the original. It seemed to me that both of those things of maybe he feels guilty as well as bereft, and maybe this is like losing a body part, in fact, the most central body part, that I needed actually to, in a way, translate twice in order to get those things. Yes, Mother, Zeus has granted me that prayer, but now what good to me is any of it? My friend Patroclus, whom I loved, is dead. I loved him more than any other comrade. I loved him like my head, my life, myself. I lost him, killed him. Hector slaughtered him and stripped from him the marvelous magic armor, the lovely gifts the gods gave Peleus the day they led you, an immortal goddess, into a mortal's bed. Okay. So the final very short bit, I know I'm slightly running out over time, but this will only take 2 minutes and then you can ask your question. So the 2-minute thing I want to say at the end is that I'm currently in the process of doing a translation of the Odyssey, which I'm very excited about. I feel like I have an idea about how to do it now. That's why the retranslation thing was in the title, because I'm totally redoing everything except for the first line. So I'm just going to read you the beginning, which is still in progress, and it may be totally different by the time I finish it, if I ever do finish it. Tell me about a complicated man, Muse, who was lost so long and fled so far when he had sacked the sacred citadel of Troy, and how he saw and understood so many people and so many places, and suffered so much in his heart at sea, as he was struggling to save his life and bring his men back home. But he did not defend his friends, although he strove to do so. Poor fools, they died by their own recklessness. They ate the cattle of Hyperion, the sun, who took away their chance of home. About these journeys tell us also, goddess, daughter of Zeus. Begin from anywhere.